name is Harold Davis. I'm here to teach you about the art and craft of digital photography.
Good morning and welcome to the Harold Davis Studio in Berkeley, California. We are so happy to have you here with us today. This webinar is Photography on Black. Images that present a subject on black or very dark background can be striking. In fact, the most iconic monochromatic photographs frequently involve a black background. In this webinar, Harold shows how to photograph with a bracketed low-key sequence to achieve perfect black backgrounds, and how to post-process images to enhance the black background effect. Today's webinar will be in 3 parts. First, Harold will start with an introduction, showing and describing some images on black. Then he will move downstairs to our living room, where we've set up a small shooting area, and he will photograph a feather, a shell, and a dahlia. After the photography, Harold will move back upstairs to demonstrate post-processing techniques. Many of you know who Harold is, but if you're joining us for the first time today, here's a little bit about Harold. Harold Davis is the developer of a unique technique for photographing flowers for transparency, the creator of Multi-RawProcessing and Hand-HDR processing. He is a Moab Master and a Zeiss Ambassador. Harold is an internationally known photographer and a sought-after workshop leader. His website is digitalfieldguide.com. Now, I'm going to stop my share and hand it over to Harold.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm very excited to be here. This is a topic, photography on black, that I care about a great deal. It's very versatile. It's not just on black, it's dark, it's not just in the studio, it's in the field. It's not just bracketed sequence, it can be done with single photographs. And as Phyllis said, we're going to start with a presentation where I'm going to talk about some of the issues and ramifications and show some examples. Then we're going to head down to a small photography area and photograph a couple of items from my collection, a feather, a dahlia, and a shell. And then I'm going to head back up here and show some examples, depending upon how much time we have, of post-production of the various images and an image that was not part of the original set of photography. So let me, without further ado, I'm going to share my screen. So this is photography on black. It's not any other kind of photography, but that covers a multitude of sins. There we go. The book arrived yesterday. We got copies of it. It's in the warehouse. It should be shipping. If you've ordered it, you should have it soon. Making great photos of flowers, gardens, landscapes, and the beautiful world around us. And it actually has a section in it on photography on black, how to bring the garden out and bring it in. And at the end of my presentation, I'll have a discount code for both books. So you don't even have to look at the Flickr stream. Here's the shell I photographed on black yesterday. And we'll photograph again to demonstrate shooting techniques. This is a turkey feather. Here in the Berkeley Hills, we have a lot of wild turkeys who wander around. And I guess Phyllis picked this up in a gas station on the parking lot. So here it is, a nice turkey feather. And this is one of my dahlias, a purple ruffles from the bed that we had growing. All right, one of the examples I have is this camellia, which in fact was not photographed in studio. It was photographed at a horticultural nursery. And as you'll see, it was photographed on a dark background, but not black. However, I did a bracketed sequence, as you'll see, and I photographed it to be, I processed it to be on black because that way it made for a dramatic photo, whereas if it had been the same key across the photograph, it would not have had this sort of softness around the petals and the nice edges that it did. A ranunculus photographed in studio on black velvet, and another dahlia. This dahlia was photographed on black velvet, but what I did was I made a cone of the black velvet. I put a small LED light in the middle and lit the center of the flower. There's a disturbance in the forest. It's the dark side. Ah! I mean, I think people really know my lightbox work is what I really stand for. But the fact is that photographing on black is just as powerful as photographing on a lightbox. And you have to look at what you have to do to get it right on the lightbox is in some ways the real inverse of what you do on a lightbox. Because with the lightbox, you photograph only the right side of the histogram. With on black, all you care about really is the left side of the histogram. But in many ways, the techniques are the same. I want to point out right here at the beginning that this is not a webinar about inverting the L channel of a lightbox image. The flower you see here was done exactly that way. It was photographed on a lightbox, and then I inverted it on the L channel. So sometimes it's hard to tell those from photography on black. So photography on black is the opposite of lightbox photography. And it's not the same as getting a black background by inverting the L channel. If you're interested in getting a black background by inverting the L channel, check out the LAB webinars that are posted up on our YouTube channel. So this pearlized nautilus like this is a great example of what you can get photographing on black. And sometimes part of the point of a photograph on black is the contrast between something like the reflected light around these measuring spoons in almost a spiral formation. Yeah, I mean, Phyllis will tell you, I sort of prowl the house looking for things to put on my black velvet. Here's a set of our cooking bowls with a nautilus slice in the center on a piece of black velvet, and some weeds from out there. By the way, I should say that anybody with any questions, please throw them into the chat box. I'm really happy to respond to questions. If there's anything that isn't clear, please let me know. With the right kind of black background, the background itself absorbs light so well that, as in this pepper, you can light the subject fairly intensely and not worry about the light spilling over too much into the background, which is one of the fun things. Here, back when I photographed one of the pacifiers of one of our kids on a black background. So you see, put all kinds of things on the black background, and a nice poppy here put upright with a black background. This one was a field photograph, like the camellia. So early in the morning, I photographed a dandelion with the morning dew on it on my belly in a field, and I did it again to create a black effect around it, although it wouldn't have been if I'd had a normal key photo. The top of a popover and a sequence of buds on a black background. The following images are what I've dubbed the Blossfeld effect, after the great photographer Carl Blossfeld, who was originally an iron worker and then did photographs as references, and then they became regarded as art themselves. I will be going over the Blossfeld effect next week in the webinar Noir on Saturday, which we're working on at this point. This is lavender via Blossfeld effect and the top of a stem. This one here, this Queen's Anne's lace, was actually the other technique, an inverse on a light box, also done via Blossfeld. And jade. So one place where you can do photography on black with in an interesting way is in when you're using studio lights and you have a model and you're doing multiple exposures or single exposures for that matter, because the black doesn't register in the multiple exposures. All you get are the lighter aspects of the image. So all these are multiple exposures on black, with relying on the natural fact that black multiplies out to nothing. This was also on black. I call this one Vitruvian Woman as opposed to Vitruvian Man after the Da Vinci drawing. And then it had a texture put in on top. And just a regular model photo on black with using underexposure so that the skin tones came out right. Here's a sort of fractured facial portrait on black, and the hands. So I want to point out that when you do this kind of photography, the LCD is not necessarily your friend. The problem is that what you review on the LCD, the camera is doing its best to make it look nice. Actually, the image on an LCD is a JPEG rendition from the raw file. I do recommend you photograph using RAW, but what you see on the LCD is a JPEG simulation of that raw file, and it's trying to get the best version of it that it can. So an exposure histogram is going to give you a better idea of what you're likely to end up with than the view on the LCD. Generally speaking, when I'm in photography mode, I check both. I look first at the LCD to see that it looks kind of decent, and then I make sure to check the histogram. So speaking of histograms, this is the slide I show in the first Photographing Flowers for Transparency webinar on lightbox photography. The red circled area is what you want when you're trying to get a high key lightbox image. So this is what you want, the red circled areas, when you're photographing on black velvet or some other black background. We should talk about different kinds of black backgrounds too in a moment, but I'll get there. The point here is really that what a histogram is a bar graph of the values that the camera is facing. So what the histogram is actually going to look like will depend upon the lights and darks. So the parabola shaped curve you see in this and the other slide very rarely actually happens. It's an idealized version of a histogram. But the midpoint line is really all you need to get the actual subject, let's say the feather on the black. And mostly the black will be pinned on the left, and you really don't want anything that's too white. So in post-production, there are a couple of ways you can go about photographing on black and enhancing the photographs you've taken. If you only have one photo, or if you have one photo that's almost there, you can do multi-RawProcessing to create a fully black background and then paste the correct exposure for your photographic subject onto the black background without worrying, because it's one shot, about how to get it. The other technique would be to do a bracketed sequence of low-key photographs and combine them together, doing layers and masking. We'll look at both ways of going about things when we get to processing some image in the third part of this presentation. Are there any questions?
Richard asks, what kind of things do you look for in subjects?
Geez, that's a great question, but one I hadn't even really thought about, Richard. I mean, because everything is grist, isn't it? I mean, one tip-off there is you see me wandering the house looking for household items like the set of bowls and the spoons and things like that. I think it's fair to say also that really dark objects probably are not going to be very good for this, right? That makes sense, doesn't it? Don't you think, Phyllis? I mean, after all, if it's really dark, why would you put it on a dark background? Because this is sort of fundamental sense of color kind of things. So typically shells are really good because most shells are fairly light. Flowers are colorful and they're not really dark. I had a dark bowl yesterday when I was doing this sort of experimentation for this webinar, and it didn't really work all that well because first of all, it was a sort of reflective, not matte black, and it reflected things back at me. But also, there wasn't much contrast with the black background. I mean, you know, it's clear that with white, you want to put translucent subjects on a light box, because otherwise, what's the point? But it's also clear that when you're on black, you want to put saturated versions that are themselves not translucent and reflective in color on them, mostly. Thanks, a great question. I would put anything on black. Almost everything looks good in black.
Mary has a question. I bought some black background paper, but it came out gray in my photo. What's the problem?
Yeah, well, this is the fundamental problem of photography on black, and that the techniques of this webinar are designed to address. So a thought experiment there, a couple of thought experiments. Suppose you have something on a white background and you take your camera and you photograph it at what your camera says is the right exposure, and the whole subject is just lit uniformly. What's the white going to come out looking like? Give you a second or two to think about that and then give you the answer.
Danielle says gray.
Yeah, thank you, Danielle. That's correct. So let's take that the other way around. Suppose you're photographing on black seamless paper or black anything, and you do a general exposure. What's the black background going to turn out like? Danielle?
And Horatia also says gray. We're getting gray, 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 gray.
Gray, 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 gray. Yes, Constance, 18% gray, probably. That will depend on what the light meter in the camera did with the subject that's on the black, so how much of it is not actually black. But you won't get a straight black background because you're averaging the subject and the black, and that terms the black gray. So the techniques in this webinar are designed to essentially get around that property of photography. I want to ask, who was it who asked this question?
Let me pop back up here.
I want to make sure that they understand what I'm saying and if they need further clarification.
It was Mary.
Mary, please let me know if that makes sense to you or if you need more clarification.
And you'll also show techniques for how to avoid the gray.
That's absolutely, of course, that's absolutely the point of it in many ways. But I just want to make sure that Mary understands why she got gray. It's a great place to start. I mean, if you want to try an experiment, photograph something against a black background, use the exposure your camera says to do, and you're going to get gray instead of black, which is...
And Mary says yes.
Perfect. Good, 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 good. Yeah, I think there's some question about what the best black material is. What I like to use, and I see Darcy says black fleece doesn't reflect it like velvet. I don't know, but the black velvet that we use is pretty unreflective. So there are various kinds of black velvet. What you want is the expensive stuff made with silk. And you need, what, about 2 yards?
Yeah, I think we have 1.5 yards or 2 yards of it.
Yeah, so HDR photos on the black bias to counter the camera tendency to make everything 18% gray. That's right, but better off doing it by hand, in my opinion. Usually I don't get that good results when I run it through an auto HDR program. So if you're going to do it using a single multi-raw exposure, you start with a version that is so dark that it makes the background truly black, and you add incremental exposures at 1 EV intervals. And I'll give a demo of doing this. And if you're going to do a hand HDR exposure, usually 6 to 8 exposures, bracket by 1 EV for each exposure, keep the ISO constant, bracket shutter speed, and there's no point going onto the right side of the histogram because you don't need that. Well, I'll show you examples of that. And start at the correct exposure, go darker, 1 EV at a time. You could go the other way around too, but it's easier to do this. And stop with the image as black when the histogram is pinned to the left, because you don't need anything blacker than black. Here's an example of one of my not my usual example of fabric too. I bought some black velvet at Joann's myself, and I'll show it to you downstairs. It just doesn't work as well as better stuff. But yeah, expensive, but not as expensive as some other things. This waterfall here is an example of using the techniques I'm going to show you in the field, because, you know, otherwise you would see more background above it. Like this, it kind of looks like a head of long pandemic hair coming down, and you don't really see that there's background around it, but there is, which is more or less gone black. Dandelions are great subjects for photography on black. They're so detailed and there's so much contrast. They're so white. This was a succulent living on our porch, and what I did with it is I put a black velvet cloth around and tucked it under it. Just some flowers on black. A nice gerbera daisy. This again, this tulip opened up like this, was photographed on a black background, and I put in a texture in the back. A black background. You know, you can also do things like tables and vases. Obviously, it takes a bit more of a setup to do something like this, but not really unreasonable. And this one with these orchids in the center of this bowl is a little bit of an answer to what kind of subject would you want, because you want something that contrasts really nicely with the background below. And yes, Danielle, the entire photo, well, completely black. You know, this is a usability issue. Truth is, I don't really use anything that's completely black usually. I mean, you know, you after all could generate something completely black without photography. You know, it's a matter it's a matter of pragmatics to some extent. I mean, I like to tell people in workshops when they're hesitant to do another bracket, well, film is so expensive. So yeah, obviously there's no real incremental cost in doing another bracketed image. The incremental cost is in, or the actual cost is getting a subject together, getting yourself up to doing photography, maybe buying a piece of black velvet in this case. One of the things that when Phyllis and I were conceptualizing this webinar, we wanted to be careful to make it something that for the most part you can do with whatever materials you have around. This is not something where you have to need to go out and buy fancy lighting. And even the velvet is, you know, if you don't get the $50 a yard velvet and get the $10 a yard velvet, it's only going to make a slight difference. We're coming to the end of the presentation part of this. Here's the discount code for the black and white book at the Rocky Nook site. It's H. Davis 40. And here's the discount code for the garden photography book, Garden 40. And here's my contact info. I'm sure Phyllis will put this up again. And are there any questions at this point?
Oh, Danielle says both books are great, and caps with exclamation points. Thank you very much, Danielle.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Reviews appreciated. Thanks. All right. It doesn't sound like there are any. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and go back to the beautiful, cool Lago di Como.
Here's one from Deborah. She wonders how you photograph the weeds. Do you do it on a light box and then invert it, or is it on black?
Yeah, those were on black. I've done it both ways with weeds. Do I attempt to have flat lighting? I see. Thank you, Charles, by the way. Thank you very much. It depends. what I'm going to show you downstairs is very minimal. I just use the ambient light from the forest fire smoke coming in through curtained windows, and I'm not going to even bother lighting too much, because one of the things when you do bracketed exposures is you really can control the lighting. In fairness and reality, for really high quality photography, of course, lighting is crucial. And the question of how much I would want it to be flat depends on what the subject is, really, and how flat or unflat the subject is. For a basically flat subject, I probably don't want to show much texture, so I probably would have fairly flat lighting. The other thing that I do sometimes use in this kind of photography is a reflector, and I will try to show an example of using a reflector with one of the setups that I do, because the point there would be if you have light predominantly coming in from one direction, it's going to cast shadows, which in this context may not be very attractive. Yeah, sometimes I use a reflector because you really, I mean, flat lighting's a good question. You don't want strong shadows, but you don't necessarily want the lighting to be flat. I think that's the best summary I could think of. So can we, unless there are other questions.
There are a couple questions that have popped in. Peter would like to know, when you do the demonstration, I have issues around the outer edges, noise and extra darkness along the edge. Is there a special way to address something like this?
Well, I understand noise, and I can talk about that. What was the other issue?
Yeah, extra darkness along.
I think that, Phyllis, your sound may have gone out again, by the way. I think that the extra darkness depends on the care you take with masking, basically. And that if you mask with enough care, you can avoid the extra darkness. I mean, you're in complete control, so you can have anything you want. With noise, it is true that boosting up a low EV version of a single shot adds noise into an image, so this must be done with care. But if you bracket the exposures and use a bracketed exposure, noise should not be a substantial issue. Do I ever use a light tent? Yeah, it's an interesting point. Is it a lens correction issue? That may be something where applying the automatic lens correction setting that you can do in the Adobe products might help with any kind of fringing or something like that, if that's really the issue. I mean, the thing about photography, one of the things about the craft of photography is there are often multiple causes for any given thing, and you kind of have to troubleshoot to work out what the issue may be. Yes, my road less traveled image is also in color up on my Flickr stream. A lens shade is a great thing to use on a camera, just like I say that film costs so much. There's almost no cost for using a lens shade, and it can improve your image considerably. So I always recommend using lens shades where possible. Long exposure can increase noise as well, of course. I am going to take a couple of minutes break, and I'll be with you down in our photography area in just a moment.
Here he
comes.
Hello. Here comes Harold. Excellent.
Yes. Oh, this is Nicholas, my unit director over here.
I can't see your face on this.
Now I can see your face.
Here I am. Here's a tripod. Let me take the cover off. And we have here some pieces of black velvet of various denominations and shapes.
So Harold, which velvet is the silk one and which one's
this
the
one here?
acetate?
And you can really tell the difference by the hand of the thing. This one, you know, I want to stroke. It feels so nice and soft. Oh. This one, it's not bad, but it's rougher and it's more reflective. Is from a photography point of view is the main thing. This one came from Joanne's, by the way. The other one came from, I think, Stone Man and Daughter.
It's Stone Mountain Daughter in Berkeley.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, there's a couple of questions if you'd like to answer them.
Sure, go right ahead. Meanwhile, I'll lay out the nice black velvet. Go ahead.
Suzanne would like to know, please define lens shade.
Suppose I don't define it, but show it. Here's a lens shade. Goes in the end of the lens. Sometimes it's designed to fit specific lenses, so you have to be a little careful about putting it on, following the dots and screwing it in. But the lens shade goes on the end of the lens. And it helps protect the lens when you're using it too, by the way, as well as increasing optical quality and letting stray light not come into the thing.
And also there's a question, have you ever tried shooting on white velvet?
Gosh, I have not, but it sounds like fun.
Yeah, that's from Curtis. Thank you, Curtis.
I mean, I'm so into lightbox stuff that probably with a white background, I'm either going to go lightbox or seamless paper, because so it doesn't have quite the same issues of getting rid of reflectivity, I think, that black does. You see how there's almost no reflectivity on parts of this black velvet at this point.
Terrence is wondering, is there a long exposure noise setting on Nikon?
Yes. And it should generally be set to the default, which is on for long exposures.
There's our turkey feather.
Generally, it comes into play. Comes into play at about a second. It doesn't really do anything for faster than a second. The thing is that, you know, there are various different kinds of noise. Noise is a big topic in and of itself, but there are various different kinds of noise. But a shorthand of what's the most totally unattractive noise is when you try to boost underexposure too much. Can everyone see the nice turkey feather that I have on the black velvet?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. Well, I'm going to take off the sort of walk around lens that I have on the camera here. Actually, first, since there was this question about lens shade, let me install the lens shade on it. So here's what the lens shade looks like on this. See? Okay, always use it if you can. Why not? It's cheap. Of all the various photo things, it's kind of not the most expensive one. It turns out that some style lenses, like the macro lens I'm about to put on, don't have lens shade options because they're so deep set. So when that happens, that's okay. This is the Zeiss 50mm f2 macro planar. As Zeiss lenses go, it's a relatively inexpensive lens. It's optically very good. Here it is, and it's what I'm going to try to use for most of this photography.
Sounds like the Starship Enterprise with all those numbers and letters.
Oh, yeah?
And Harold, there's a question about what kind of tripod do you use for this? Joe would like to know.
This is a really right stuff studio grade tripod here. So it's probably a little overkill here, but more unsharpness is introduced to images by not using a tripod that's steady enough than almost anything else I can think of. Note also that I have a system here where the camera is firmly around my neck until I have it locked well into place, and then I have quick release on the straps like this. And then the strap comes off and it's out of my way. So here I am focused on this nice feather. And when I have the camera set on manual at ISO 64 and f22, okay? You know, if 22 is overkill, why don't I put it down to like 14? I want a bit of depth of field. So the camera tells me that 15 seconds is the right exposure. So I'm going to sit back down here and do a 15-second exposure. And that should be the longest exposure that I have to do for this image. as Terrence points out, long exposure noise reduction should be on. That should ameliorate the problems of noise with this image. What also is going to happen is that at 15 seconds, the black velvet background will not be black. You know, in fact, I'm looking at it and I can see the creases in it. The feather is okay. So what I do next is I shoot it at 8 seconds, half 1 EV darker. I'm supposed to look up.
You're supposed to look up more.
My unit director says I'm supposed to look up even though I'm photographing.
I think you're doing great.
The
Barbara would like to know, are you matrix metering or center weighted?
This is matrix metering.
Neo.
I mean, so as Nicholas just said, Neo. So if I were to spot meter, okay, there's another possibility. She's center weighted or matrix, but you could also do spot. If you spot on the subject, then you're going to get the actual right reading for the feather. So that would actually be a better approximation of doing it. But this technique is assuming I'm just taking an average reading, and it's sort of like a blunderbuss technique. Because film is so expensive, I can overshoot this, and then as we'll see when we look at actual examples, I'll have plenty to work with when I head back up to Photoshop and actually process them. So this was a 4-second exposure, and I look at it in the histogram as well as the LCD just to see, and actually we're starting to get there. We're getting pretty pinned on the left side, which is what we ultimately want.
And Lorraine would like to know, what lens are you using? She said she missed it.
I'm using the 50mm Zeiss Macro Planner f2. So a lens I highly recommend as a macro lens. If you're looking for your first macro lens, it's quite generally useful.
And Richard would like to know, how again did you arrive at the original exposure?
I let the camera tell me what to do. I set I put it on manual exposure. I set the ISO at 64, which is the native ISO for this camera. I set the f-stop to f14, and I let the camera tell me where I should put my shutter speed. And of course, it created an image that was really much too bright for the effect that we want, which is part of the point of this demo. Now I'm approaching total blackness here. So at 1/8 of a second, I'm gonna stop. So I did about 8 exposures. I didn't count precisely, going from, and we'll have a look at exposures of an example like this, going from 1/8 of a second to 15 seconds. So that's quite a range. If you look at it, 1/8 to 15 is 8 times 15 is 120 times from bottom to top. Okay, so that's approaching more dynamic range than even the human eye has. I'm going to move on to...
My poor peepers.
I'm going to put the feather behind my ear. Am I allowed to do that? No. And I'm going to move on to this dahlia here.
I have a solution for you if you want your feather behind your ear.
No, thank you.
And Joe would like to know, the remote control you use, it goes with your Nikon, yes?
Yes, this is a Nikon M36A. It's a remote Nikon. It's preposterously expensive. Okay, and it's all, besides being a remote release, it's an intervalometer, which is a fancy word for a programmable interval timer. And, you know, what I would say is, don't buy a cheap knockoff, even though it's stupidly expensive. Okay, so we have...
What's the best way you can still retain the quality but still have a reasonable budget?
Buy the brand name Nikon one and bite the bullet if you're using Nikon. There are no shortcuts.
Mhm.
So we have here a nice big dinner plate size dahlia from my garden before the forest fire grunge hit it. And I'm going to stop my lens down, and using my matrix metering and an autopilot on this in manual mode, it tells me that 5 seconds is the right exposure. So the reason that I get a brighter exposure here than I did with the feather is there's more flower coverage of the black than there was feather coverage of the black. So this is a 5-second exposure. And again, it's not bad, but it's too bright for the background. So I go 2.5 seconds for the next darker. And I'm going to go to 1.3 seconds, which is the next EV down. Okay, we're getting pretty close to black here. And 1/1.6 of a second. I don't really know what that works out to in a fraction, but that's okay. And 1/2 of a second. So we go from 1/2 a second to 5 seconds here, only 10 times range, but it does the trick. Okay, so these white boxes I have over here have some of my shell collection. And what we have right off the bat here is a nice nautilus shell. Now, this brings up the question of should the lighting be flat? So I need to be a little closer to my nautilus here. So about like that. And one thing that would be nice to do here is to reflect a little light into the nautilus. So I have here a handy dandy little reflector. And since predominantly the light here is coming from the direction of Nicholas, which is behind the screen, I'm going to put the reflector over here. And what this serves to do is to beam light into the parts of the nautilus.
Beam me up, Shelley.
That's exactly right. Beam me up, Shelley. Into the parts of the nautilus that were in shadow before. Shall I try that again, or can people see the difference? Okay.
I don't think I can see the difference.
I use the silver side of the reflector, Danielle.
Right. And there's Terrence has a question. Are you 3-clicking to change the shutter?
Yes.
Oh.
So Terrence's point there is that on the Nikons, the default setting is at 3 turns of the shutter speed dial turns the shutter speed 1 EV. You can actually program that if you don't like it to set it to something else, but that's how it comes from the factory. And if I had handy a warm gold reflector, I might use that instead of a silver one. Really, you know, this kind of thing, it comes back to the ability to look at and see light, which is truly the crucial issue. There are all kinds of ways to go about it once you have practice doing this that are fun. Okay, I went from 1/10 of a second here, and I made sure to look and see that I'm basically pinned against the left side of the histogram, and I didn't pay much attention to the nonsense that the LCD is giving me on it. And I used this here nice reflector, silver white, and to get it back in to its case, you do a double flip. This is something that people have told me they sometimes have problems with, which I understand because it took me about 25 years as a master photographer to learn how to put the field reflectors away. Something basically, by the way, that I carry when I do outdoor garden photography as well.
Just like in Harold Davis's new book, Creative Garden Photography.
Oh, Nicholas, I love you, dear.
I'm the shitless plug today.
Lorraine would like to know if you can get a Canon mount for the macro planar lens.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, you don't want the Nikon mount one. You want to get one specifically for a Canon mount, correct?
Correct. All right, let's take a little bit of a break, and then I'll start up on processing images.
Hi, Harold.
Hello, everyone.
Deborah has a question. What was the shutter sequence for the Nautilus?
Roughly speaking, as we can look at the one that I processed that will have the shutter speed and the EXIF information as I process it, because this is essentially replicating what I photographed yesterday. But roughly speaking, I think it was 5 seconds to about 1/5 of a second.
And Joe has the question, when you use the remote control, could you let us know what is the setting to get multiple photos? I think you're just using the remote control as a shutter release, right?
I am. That's correct. I'm using it as a shutter release. If I wanted to do this automatically, Joe is correct that I could program the intervalometer to do that, but it would probably be easier to photograph the camera itself to do that using an auto bracket setting, which would be what I would recommend if you don't want to actually move the shutter yourself. However, when the camera is on a good steady tripod, doing it the way I did it is probably best, because that way you can see whether you're really getting enough exposures and how well they do. And yes, I was stopping by 1 EV each time.
Nancy would like to know, are you using exposure compensation at all or just using the shutter speed?
I'm not using exposure compensation at all. And I would furthermore say that on manual exposure, exposure compensation is essentially irrelevant. Okay, so this is something to think about a little. And you know, I by no means am I casting any kind of whatever, because exposure is something that's fundamentally hard to get your brain around. But what people use exposure compensation for is on one of the programmed exposure modes, most often a fully programmed automatic or aperture preferred. And you say, okay, I know I want the aperture of this thing to be at f/16. Okay, so I'm setting aperture preferred f/16, and then I know that automatic is coming in too light, so I go minus 1.5 EV in exposure compensation, and that the camera will then take care of it. I don't have to worry too much about the nitty-gritty. The problem in manual exposure is that the camera isn't really changing anything automatically for you whatsoever. So the only thing that exposure compensation will do is it will change the value coming in as the light reading. It won't really change the camera setting in manual mode. Nancy, if that doesn't quite satisfy you, let me know and I can try and hit it from some other direction. We have here a camellia. I showed the image. It was also on the slide that Phyllis had, I think, for this webinar. And yeah, and so this was photographed in the field, and with a 200mm macro, ISO 100, f7.1, and this is a 50th of a second, this is a 100th of a second, and this is a 25th of a second. Probably the 25th of a second exposure is what the camera at the time told me to photograph at. What I've prepared here, so that we don't spend all day watching me convert things, are some different versions of the of the image that are just reduced. So the general idea here was to start with the darkest exposure like this. Remember that if I did what the camera told me to do, something like this is what I would come up with. That's not so terrible. That's the 1/25th exposure, but it's not the image that I pre-visualized or wanted. I wanted it on a very dark, almost black background. So what I can do here is I can take the 1/25th exposure, and yeah, see, I'm trying to get my desktop in a row here. And I can move the lighter exposure on. Phyllis, or when you get a chance, could you tell the person who asked where in the garden photography book the photography on black pages are?
Yes, I will.
And because I don't remember. And I need to see my, boy, I need to see my tool panel. Why isn't my tool panel showing? Phyllis, any idea? Tools.
Is it on the other screen?
Ah, that's it. It's on the other screen. You're perfectly right. How do I get it on this screen?
Drag it over.
It isn't dragging so far. Here we go. Here's layers, channels. There we go.
And Charles would like to know, are you shooting parallel to each of these subjects?
You know, for the most part, everything I've shown is parallel. That's a great question, but there's no reason it would have to be. Okay, I mean, you know, you could, after all, design this any way you wanted. Photography is in some substantial part applied design, and so what I have, so, you know, if as long as it's on a black background, everything should work whether or not you are. So what I have here is essentially the very dark black background, almost black. And I have here the much lighter camellia. So what I'm going to do is I am going to put a layer mask onto the 1/25th of a second lighter image, layer mask, hide all. And I'm going to take my brush tool and I'm going to make the circle here pretty close to the outer perimeter of the camellia. I'm going to make this fairly hard, and I'm going to paint in the lighter image at 100%. Okay. And that is more or less the secret to this. Keep in mind this was photographed in field conditions, and it turns a very plain, a relatively plain shot of this wonderful Camellia japonica into a fairly special image. Could I fix a less than black background with Nick Vivesa? To some extent. Nick Vivesa, in the right circumstances, a very wonderful plugin, and I use it quite a bit. And to some extent, it can make blacks blacker and whites whiter. It's a nice plugin. But the general principle always should be, if you can get it right in the camera, get it right in the camera. That'll save you time and be better quality. But yeah, you know, you can use Vivesa or other exposure correction tools to make something that wasn't black. The keys to the kingdom, I like that. And I'm blown away by this whole thing too. It's really great. Danielle, I'm not sure I understand that question about am I using the original garden versions? Do I need to clarify anything?
I think, she wanted to know whether you were shooting on black or you're shooting on in the field. And this one was at the local horticultural nursery, right?
Correct.
Yeah. And so you can see like a little bit of leaf down there on the left, but that's easy to fix.
Yeah, in the final version of this, which I've shown, you don't see anything like that. You just take more care with the masking. Okay, let's go on to the next example. That was a 2-second mask there. There's no reason you can't put 10 minutes into it. So feather. Here you've got the feather at 20 seconds, and on my screen I can see a bit of the background in this, dots and various imperfections in the velvet and some reflection. It's also actually too bright on the feather too. And 10 seconds, 5 seconds, 2.5 seconds, 1.3 seconds, 0.6 seconds, 0.3 seconds is almost completely black. So basically with this one, here we have the reduced size versions. Basically with this one, what I'm actually going to do is not use the fully black one because there's no real need, but I'm starting here at the 1.3 second ones in Photoshop and make it a little bit more reasonable size. And I go and here's the 2.6 second version, 2.5 seconds, and I copy it on top. Okay, shut down the 2.5, closing bridge so it doesn't confuse me too much. Let's label this stuff, 1.3 sec and 2.5 sec. And now I'm going to put a hide all layer mask on top. Layer, layer mask, hide all. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a brush. I'm going to try to match it to the size here, and I'm going to paint in the feather. And what I'm going to try to do for myself to save time on this image is I'm going to use the same mask that I'm painting on future images. What I want to be careful about though, since the stem, what one might call the writing part of this, is not so far off from how you'd want it. I don't want to paint that in with the same vigor, shall we say, that I would paint in the rest of the feather, which is darker. So I'm going to paint that in at quite low opacity here, just about like that. Okay. So now I'm going to move to the next up one. And this is the 5-second version. Okay. And I'm going to put a hide all layer mask, layer mask, hide all. And let me paint that in a bit. Well, actually, I'm just going to use the layer mask from the last one. I don't have to do much painting. So the technique I used there was to hold down the Alt key and drag my layer mask over. And that worked pretty well. And now I'm going to move to the, why don't I skip a step here and move to the 20-second version? Why not?
So usually, Harold, if you're processing like on your own time on your production machine, you're going to be using more steps in between for this, and it'll be a obviously much slower process.
Yeah, although something like this feather went pretty quickly, in all honesty, on my production. I mean, yeah, I mean, I'm not going to accept, Phyllis and I have a pretty general feeling about work that if you're going to do something like create images, it's worth doing the best that you can, right? So I don't knowingly do anything sloppily, if ever I can help it. But this does not have to be a terribly time-consuming process, on the other hand.
And Suzanne has a sort of related question. Are you using each of these images to get all the details from the feather? Otherwise, couldn't you just make 2 images, dark and light?
Depends on the situation. It's a good question, Suzanne. It depends on the situation. I mean, sometimes 2 are enough. I mean, consider with that camellia, I just used 2 images. But there are 2 things. One, the more images you do, the more possibility for gradient you have. What you have is the ability to enter different exposures at every point based on what you have. This is something like the digital version of the zone system. Right here, what I'm doing, and I'm going to boost up my opacity here, is I'm painting in the core of this feather. So you see, I have the right and ability to paint in whatever I want. In real life, I would certainly be more careful about this one. So the other thing is that if you only do 2 exposures in a studio situation, it's very easy to overbump and not quite get what you're after, because the dividing lines between the various exposures can look awfully stark, which isn't what you want. You want things to look natural. So the more exposures you make in some situations, the more natural things can look. I mean, so I'm giving you a nuanced answer, which is in part that sometimes, but not always, you can get away with fewer exposures. Okay.
But generally, you'd probably want more exposures just so you have the whole the whole range there.
That's correct. I always photograph more because film is so expensive. Every time I've not done that, I've lived to regret it. Before I go on to show the next couple of examples, the dahlia and the shell, let me show you what these 2 look like again, because we do have that possibility. So give me 1 sec here. I'll just pull them up. Okay. Oops. So here's a feather. All right. And there's a dahlia. So let's see, we do the dahlia next. And yes, I think I saw something about Photoshop. I'm a Bridge and Photoshop user primarily, because most of my images end up in Photoshop regardless. So Lightroom doesn't do that much for me. If I have to do the same thing to many images, I might use Lightroom. And if you're more familiar with Lightroom than Bridge, you certainly can use Lightroom to process a variety of photos, but eventually, if you're going to combine layers, you do have to get them into a program that can handle layers, of which Photoshop is certainly the premier example. There are a few others that do layers, the On1 software suite, for example, but I recommend doing it in Photoshop. This is the dahlia at 2.5 seconds, the dahlia at 1.3 seconds, the dahlia at 0.6 seconds, the dahlia at 1.4, and the dahlia at 1.8 seconds. Keep it at 1/8 of a second. Keep in mind that everything looks darker on the screen here to you than it looks to me for whatever reason. This perhaps has to do with calibration or with images going off over zoom. Keep in mind also that this is this is what the camera said is the correct exposure for this. So what we want is a completely black background. What we can get for our the way we can get our completely black background, and we probably can do it in two here, is to open up a black one, which is, it's got a dahlia under there somewhere. I can just begin to make out the petals. And this was 1/8 of a second, if I can get my mouse over there. And then I am going to open up the, and this was 2.5 seconds. As Phyllis said, in real life, doing something like this, I am going to take a lot more pains with it. In some ways, the point of all this is to give you the idea, not so much to show you detailed, specific implementation. At the risk of echoing Nikki, though, if you want to see the steps shown out before you, I do recommend the section in the garden photography book on this.
So Harold, just to copy that layer over right now, what did you do?
So there are two ways to copy a layer over. One, there's the terminology that we use here is source and target. The source is what's going on top as an aligned layer. The target is what is underneath. One of the ways is with the source, you go select all, and there are keyboard shortcuts for this as well, but I like to read out the menu commands because you can actually see those via Zoom, but you can use the keyboard shortcuts as well. Then still on the source, you go edit, copy. Then with the target selected, you go edit, paste, and that will bring the image over in precise alignment. The other thing you can do is you hold down the shift key, you use the move tool from the tool panel, and you drag the source over the target, then you let go of the mouse before you let go of the shift key. Layer mask, hide all. I see a question about how I organize my photos in Bridge Photoshop. Can we see your file quick? It's a great question, but not an easy one to answer. I mean, I put a fair amount of effort and thought into organization, but when you say see my file, what exactly do you mean? See my file structure and how I organize, that's going to be a hard thing to share here. One of the things we have is a system of network attached storage, which is organized, which is the archive basically, and it's organized in annual volumes in reverse chronologic order within a given month. So for each year, for each set I photograph, I set up a file that contains the raw files, contains the work in progress, and contains the final master versions. From those master versions, we have to pull off different versions depending upon how they're profiled, where they're printed, and various other things. So, organization is a big issue, but if you're not going to use a program like Lightroom, then you have to think carefully about how you do it and set up a consistent scheme and follow it, which we do. The problem with Lightroom's organization, honestly, is that people don't really know where their actual files are always. That's one of the problems. So I quote the Arthur Weasley principle on that: never trust anything magical that thinks if you don't know where it keeps its brains. So I really prefer to have manual control. I may give a webinar on digital file management at some point, explaining my workflow, but it's really a substantial topic, an interesting, important topic, but a substantial one.
Yeah, Harold, so you have your file system mostly set up by date. There's the sort of over file that's the year, but then within each year file are just like every day Harold takes photos. He makes a brand new folder with the date and a little, just, a very short description, just 10, 15 characters of what it is. A slug.
A slug, but where's the history? No, I'll just go Control Z. Okay. A slug, but it's more complicated than that, because you also need to have a catalog system. How do you find something? So we have a system for doing that, where we use either the tools within the file system. We also use my Flickr feed as a way to find something. So Flickr's tools for discovery are actually better than you're likely to have on your own. So if I go through everything, every image of mine that I care about goes up on my Flickr feed, and that feed is used as part of our catalog to find a chronologic-based system. It's also used as the basis for our copywriting process. Every image of mine gets registered as a copyrighted image, which turns out to be quite important. Show the mask I just drew here. So that's, roughly speaking, the shape of the dahlia. So we have the 2.5 second dahlia over the 1/8. Of course, to lower the image down, we would need to actually use this image. After this, the next step would be to go layer, flatten image. One of the reasons that the black background is not lightening is because, this is an answer to a question from Rita, is that I have my brush set to be quite hard, relatively speaking. So over here on the tool options, there's a hardness setting. The harder it is, the less it's going to spray stuff around it. So it's painting there's a quite hard edge around the dahlia. Okay, here's our dahlia. Let me move on to the shell, nautilus. So here we have 4 seconds. Here we have 2 seconds. 1 second, 1/4 second. So it really doesn't matter whether you photograph these to go from darkest to lightest or lightest to darkest. In this case, we're going from darkest at 1/4 second to lightest. And here are the reduced versions. And this one is 1/4 second.
And Lorraine has a question. She says, using aperture priority as my choice rather than manual, is that going to make a difference in quality?
So it makes no difference in quality whatsoever. It's just a matter of how it responds to the exposure in front of you. But it's very hard to use this multi-shot technique with aperture priority metering. The only way you could do it would be also to use exposure compensation between each exposure. And the actual fact is that manual metering is easy, manual exposure setting is easier for this than using aperture priority. In general, if I'm walking around on the street, a lot of the time I would prefer to use aperture priority also, but it's just not appropriate for this kind of photography in the same way.
And Joe would like to know, how do you replace a black background, replace the background with black if it's not black?
Well, the easiest, I mean, you know, as in Photoshop, there are always many ways to do things, but the easiest way to do that is paint over it with black. You know, I like to say a pixel doesn't know, or a pixel has 2 mothers and doesn't know which one it comes from. In your final image, they're not going to know whether you painted it in with a Photoshop paintbrush dipped in black or whether it's from the camera. You can also do a select and replace, another possibility, but usually the easiest way, if my black background is incomplete, let me give you an example. My black background is incomplete. Let's make this one incomplete. Let me pick a color of some kind. I got to move my color picker over into here. I don't know why it's there. Okay. Yeah. All right. And I'm going to say sort of short, Phyllis XXOOO. Okay. So Phyllis, that's short for I love you, right?
Yep. And you're going to paint that over?
Oh gosh, I can't win on this one, can I?
No, no.
Uh, so let's say I really want that to be black. Let's say I photographed it and there was this red Phyllis, I love you there. So I'm gonna hit the little thing here to get black to be my foreground color. I'm gonna take my brush, I'm gonna put it at 100%, 100, and I'm going to make it reasonably big, and I'm just gonna paint out that thing that I photographed there by mistake. So, okay, let's put this one in. And this was the 1 second one. Layer, layer mask, hide all. And again, I would be more careful about this for the real version. And sometimes I love doing this in some sense because it's a reveal. It's a little bit like it used to be having prints come out in the developer in a darkroom. You see what's underneath coming out. And now let's go up to the really light version. This is 4 seconds. Layer. And I'm not going to put this in at 100% because it's probably too bright for that. So I'm turning my flow down to 50%. And my opacity is sitting at 54%. And there we go. And I can control what part I want where on here. So since white reveals and black conceals, when you have a partly gray mask like this, it partly reveals. And I'm on a perfect black background here, which is what I was looking for. So
Mary would like to know, will correcting the white balance affect the final black?
No, not in most circumstances. This is white balance independent. It may affect how the black looks. Okay, so here we have a nautilus. I'm afraid it's a little dark looking on the Zoom screens, but there it is. And almost all the images shown in this presentation were created using the techniques that I've just shown you. Flow versus opacity. Flow is how fast it comes out of the brush. So think of it like an airbrush. Flow is how fast it comes out of the brush. Opacity is how dark it paints it in at. So you use flow to control better. You use opacity to control the amount it masks. Does photo stacking use the same technique? Depends what the photo stacking is for. This is a form of photo stack that is used for manual exposure bracketing. There are different kinds of photo stacks. You can use one for focus stacking, and there actually are some other choices as well. Well, I'm moving through this to get to the question slide, of course.
Danielle would like to know, do you remember where you purchased the nautilus shell?
On the internet.
I guess do a search and see what you can find.
Well, you know, it's like many things in this world. I bought a bunch of them many years ago. They are in fact becoming harder to find, and there's some question about whether we really should be purchasing nautiluses anymore. But there you have it. We also used to have a wonderful store here in Berkeley that was a great resource for me, called the Bone Room, and it's no more. It's gone online. Are there any other questions? Let me stop sharing my screen.
Wait a minute here. Oh, Chris would like to know, can you describe your masking process on images with complicated subjects like a busy still life or the wild grasses?
Well, it's going to depend. I mean, I was going to go to something glib like very carefully, or the way two porcupines make love. But um, look, Photoshop has got a lot of masking. Masking is a complex subject, is about selection. The two things are the same thing. Photoshop and plugins such as Topaz have a lot of tools that help with selection. The question you've got to sit down and think about, if it's a complex masking topic, is what is going to be the easiest way to do this? Is there a color you can select for that will do it? Is there one of the color channels in one of the color spaces that can be used via a technique like luminance masking to do it? Is one of the quick mask tools going to help you? What is the easiest way to do this? I tend to like to do my masks where possible by hand, but I also, when I'm confronted with a complicated topic, I often want to take a few minutes and sit and think, here, what are the Photoshop tools I can use here, and what is going to make this easier? I think perhaps Phyllis and I should do a masking webinar one of these days.
Judy would like to know, I noticed your blending mode was set as normal. Would lighter mode help refine what gets brightened?
Yeah, that's a great question, Judy. I mean, absolutely yes. And in fact, in some cases, I use other blending modes besides normal when I'm doing this process, and it's really going to depend on the situation. Using screen blending mode will lighten further. Rarely do I want to use that across an entire layer, but certainly sometimes I will use part of a layer in screen blending mode to selectively brighten things. The other blending modes besides normal that are often used in this process are multiply and soft light. You multiply to darken, soft light to basically increase dynamic separation, increase dynamic range, making lights lighter and darks darker. With soft light, you would never want to use it at much more than 10 to 20% opacity. With screen blending mode, it's great to use where you need it, but understand that using too much of it can increase noise in the image.
And here there's a question about, does Harold do any finishing techniques? I'm thinking of textures on pictures of this type.
Well, yeah, I mean, the short answer is, of course I do. Yes, I do. And in fact, I have a course I did for LinkedIn Learning. You can find the
I just put the link into the chat. That's what I was doing.
You can find the link where Phyllis put it in chat. She was reading my mind.
Darcy would like to know, do you ever use a Wacom tablet? I have one, but rarely use it.
Well, Darcy, you know, that's a matter of personal preference. I too have a Wacom tablet attached to my production machine. I only use it in situations where I have really nitty drawing to do, you know, fine hairs and things like that. I suspect if I used it more, I'd be better with it, and I would use it more often. So it's a vicious circle or a virtuous circle. You know, if what you're doing works for you, then don't use it. If you feel you want more pinpoint control, then take the time to get good with it. What is really cool are the monitors, the Wacom monitor that you can draw on. That is genuinely something, but I don't have one. It's such fun stuff, though. Anyway, you do it. Well, are there any more nice questions here?
And Joe would like to know, what's the tripod model? I'll go look for it.
Yeah, I don't remember actually. But you know, it's pretty obvious when you go to the Really Right Stuff site.
Right, and they have their carbon fiber tripods and.
Yeah, it's not a cheap tripod, but my recommendation is don't buy a cheap tripod. I mean, you'll just get frustrated. I mean, I've had students go through workshops and they come in with a rinky-dink tripod, and after we do lightbox for transparency for flowers, they say, okay, I'm going to get a better tripod. So they get an intermediate one, and then about a year later, they buy a really good one. So, you know, you would save time, trouble, and money just to get the good one. I'm not in favor of spending money typically, particularly these days, but it's a little odd that people are willing to spend thousands of dollars on cameras, but not on a tripod, which likely will be with you forever.
Carol would like to know, what ball head do you recommend for close control?
Yeah, so that's also a really right stuff ball head on that tripod that I use. I've got a bunch of different ball heads, but the really right stuff ones are good. The Kirk Enterprise BH3 is another good choice. A little less expensive.
Great.
And I think Carrie
yeah.
has the right answer there, by the way,
Yeah,
for the model number.
That's the model number, I think.
I think so.
Right.
But you have options, of course, with it. You have options. Do you want a center pole? Answer would be, I do, but not everybody does. It's got pluses and minuses. All photography equipment craft questions are trade-offs. There are some pluses and some minuses, and you just have to balance it out. Really right stuff on the ball heads also offers you the choice of the kind of camera clip you have. There's a quick release or a screw. The advantages of one are not the disadvantages of the other. The quick release lives up to its name and is quick release and doesn't take a whole lot of hand strength. The screw takes hand strength and is not as sure, but the advantage is that you don't just have to use finely milled, really right stuff plates with it. It will work with any plate. So I use screws on mine, but there are trade-offs there. And there are trade-offs for all these things. I would say that creative garden photography has a fairly long section on tripods and ball heads in it, right, Phyllis?
Absolutely. We even photographed your tripods. The
4 tripods that I typically use for various things are photographed in the book, which is probably the only photograph of gear that one is likely to see in any of my books in the foreseeable future.
Right. All right. I think that's about it. I don't see anything popping up in the chat at the moment. I guess we're good.
Stay healthy, everybody, please. And please, thank you for coming. I hope you have fun photographing. It's a great thing to do these days.
I hope you enjoyed this video and found it informative. Be creative and stay mighty.